everybody, Gary here with Guitar Tricks, and in this video we're going to go over how to use a floating vibrato, or you might call it a tremolo, or you might call it the wang bar. Lots of different names for this thing, a floating bridge, to add expressiveness into your playing, so to open up some new possibilities. Now I'm coming from the perspective of like blues, rock, funk, jazz, R&B, not metal, so no dive bombs here and crazy effects. We're just going to talk about ways to use it on chords, ways to use it on single notes, and I'm going to tell you how I set it up so that I get a specific interval when I pull up on it. On the high E string, I can go from this note to this note, and then from the B string, I could go from this note to this note, and then from the G, I can go from here to here. So we'll go over that as well. Before we get into the lesson, please go ahead and click subscribe so that you get all the latest and greatest content from Guitar Tricks. And if you want to be notified of any new lesson, be sure to also tap the bell. All right, so the beauty of having a floating vibrato is that you can go both up and down in pitch. So if I play a chord, I can go down or up, right? And when I do vibrato, I can go, if this is the note, I can go above it and below it. So it has a more expressive quality. Now, a lot of players that have Strat style guitars will fix the bridge to the body so that they could only dive bomb, only go down. And there are some advantages of that. Like when I bend a note on my floating vibrato, I'm gonna bend the high E string and play the low E string. Watch what happens. See how that string went out of tune when I bent this string, because bending any string pulls the whole bridge. So you can't do things like, you know, those nice double stop riffs. You can't really do those unless you learn how to hold your palm just right over it. Something I'm working on, but you can do that, which is pretty cool. All right, so the first thing to do is just when you play a chord, and let's use the two chords from my loop in the intro. So we had D minor 7, 5th fret on the A string, first finger, bar your first finger across that 5th fret. Take your 3rd finger, put it on the 7th fret of the D, 5th fret of the G, get your first finger, and then 6th fret of the B, get your 2nd finger. And then first finger again on the 5th fret of the high E. So now we'll play that chord and give it a little bit of a wiggle. Hear the difference between going down and up, and try to see if you can put the two together. Then we go to the chord G7, which is the same fingering, but everything moves up one string closer to your nose and to the 3rd fret instead of the 5th fret. So that was my loop, was from D minor 7 to G7. It's a 2-5 progression in the key of C. This is the 2 chord D minor, and the 5 chord is G7. But we never go to the 1, so it's actually D Dorian mode jam. So that's one way to use it. Now another way to use it is David Gilmour style, which is where you take a note, let's say take this blues riff, now I'm in D pentatonic, D minor pentatonic. Let's say I played this riff. Now I could give it a little finger vibrato on the top, but it kind of sounds really cool to go like this. Right? Yeah. And David Gilmour did that a lot. He would just bend a beautiful note and then give it vibrato at the top. So again, it's just, I'm holding it real loose and just going back and forth. Another way to use it is to do these little trail offs This reminds me of Jeff Beck a lot. Very subtle. So it's just like another way to sound more like a singer, because singers never go do 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 do. They go boo doo ba dee do. Little tiny trail off. And I'm just very lightly touching the bar. And you could experiment with how much. And if you put it more on an angle, it'll be more subtle, because now when you press it, you're not pressing straight down, you're like kind of angling it. So when it's right here, touching it goes further than when it's here, if that makes sense. Now you could make it really dramatic, right? Now another thing you can do is just a quick up and down. Let's try it with that jam track. Now instead of doing a subtle trail off, we could do it big, you know, until you find a spot where it sounds good. You know? And then in order to kill the note so it doesn't come back up, you know, just flatten your fingers out. Just release pressure off the note. Then we could also just slap it. Gives it a cool sound like this. Another thing you can do is keep the whammy back here, and this is called a flutter, I believe, where you hit it and let it flutter a little bit like this. One thing is hitting it can cause some string noise. But, you know, when there's a track going on, it won't be as audible as it is right now. Let's hear it with the track. You really don't have to press it hard at all. I'm probably pressing it too hard. I like doing a hammer-on and a flutter at the same time, like. So the last thing we're going to go over is how to set up your tremolo so that on the high E string, you go up a half step when you pull all the way back. On the B string, you go up a whole step when you pull back. And then on the G string, you go up a step and a half. So it's not perfect, but it's really close. And if you add a little bit of vibrato and maybe a slight bend here and there, it works almost perfectly. And I did a lot of that in the intro. So it's all about finding the right balance of the springs and the strings, balancing the tension of the springs and the strings. So depending on what gauge strings you have, what guitar you have, you just have to futz with it. So if you have 9s, I recommend 2 springs. And if you have 10s, I recommend 3 springs. 11s, 3 springs will also work great. If you want to, you know, get the vibrato flush with the body, that's when you put 5 springs and just hold it real tight like Jimmy or Stevie Ray did. But to get the floating, 2 or 3. So you want to get it floating a couple millimeters to start, tune your guitar up, and then while it's in tune, test the high E string. Go like this, get a tuner even, and then play an E, and then pull it up, and it should be an F. Now it's important that the entire guitar is in tune before you test it, because every string affects the action of the vibrato. If your other strings are out of tune and you're testing it, when you retune those strings, it's going to throw everything off. So whole guitar in tune, test it. If your F is flat, if it's not quite an F, then that means you have to loosen the string claw a little bit. Loosen it a little bit, bring it out a little bit, try again. And just, you know, like a quarter turn sometimes, a half turn, little by little. The whole process could take you an hour to start, and then it'll gradually get quicker as you get used to it. Now, when you're tuning a floating vibrato, sometimes what I like to do as I go through the strings, I'll tune the E, A, and D sharp. I'll tune those sharp and then gradually get less sharp until I get to the B and the E, and I turn those exact, because what happens is as you tune each string, the whole vibrato makes all the strings go flat. So I compensate by tuning sharp, sharp, sharp. Then when I get to these two, these get really close to in tune, even though I tune them sharp. So getting used to a floating vibrato for tuning is a thing. Now they make these tuners called polytune, where you could strum all your strings at the same time and see which are in tune and which are out of tune. These are really useful for people that have a floating vibrato, because you'll see as you turn one string, the other goes flat, and you could kind of play whack-a-mole with tuning your strings that way. So there's a really good video by Carl Verheyen. He's a floating tremolo extraordinaire who talks more in depth on how to set that float perfectly. All right, so then once you have that, how do you use that? Well, if you're familiar with the scale, like let's say here we were in D minor or D Dorian. Here's the D minor scale. And you know in the D minor scale, there's a half step right there. Well, then you know you could do that instead of, right? And then on the next string, if you know there's a whole step, then you know I could go a whole step right there. Then here, where can I find a step and a half? You know. Right here. Right, so you can use it in place of a fretted note. Right? And then you could do things like so it really just comes down to knowing when your next target note is a whole step away, a half step away, or a step and a half, depending on what string you're on. All right, everybody, I hope that lesson was helpful. I hope you feel like you have a new tool in your toolbox now. If you don't have a floating bridge guitar, it's not for everyone. I wouldn't go, you know, for the first time, go buy the best Strat style guitar you could find. Just get something to make sure you like it and it's something you want to use. You know, you can find a secondhand Squier or made in Mexico Fender or something like that just to try it out. I've had a love-hate relationship with floating vibratos for years now. You know, like I said, it's harder to keep your guitar in tune when you have one of these. There's all sorts of things, aftermarket bridges people have made, little things you could add to your guitar. Like I have this little screw in the back that can fix it when I no longer want it floating. I can screw this thing that will hold the block. This is called the tremolo block or the vibrato block. It'll hold it in place so that it won't go backwards anymore. So there are ways to deal with it, but you know, it adds something that once you get a taste for it, you're always going to miss it. And that's kind of where I'm at. Having the ability to use it to go up and down, when I don't have that, I feel like something's missing. Now with guitars like a Jazzmaster or a Bigsby, you're not going to be able to set that perfect, you know, half step, whole step, step and a half. That really requires one of these Strat style vibratos to do that. But all those other flutter techniques and the trail off and the chord vibrato, you could do that with any floating bridge on any vibrato system. All right, everybody, happy playing, and I'll see you in the next lesson.